You're holding one right now, or it's leaning by your door, or crushed in the bottom of your bag. Two of its spokes already bent the wrong way. It's the least romantic object you own. A few metal ribs, a sheet of nylon, a button that only half works. But the thing in your bag was once so scandalous that a man was pelted in the streets of London for carrying it. For most of human history, it had nothing to do with rain. It was a sacred object, held over the heads of god-kings. And the man who finally made it normal for ordinary people to use spent 30 years being publicly humiliated for it. You think of it as protection from the weather. For 3,000 years, it was protection of a completely different kind. It was a way of announcing that the person standing underneath it was more important than you. I'm Aidan Thomas of the Hidden Chronicle, and this is the story of how a symbol of the gods became the most disposable object in your life. This is the history of the umbrella. To find the real beginning, you have to forget rain entirely. The first umbrellas were never built to keep anyone dry. They were built to keep the sun off the right people. And the word itself gives the secret away. Umbrella comes from the Latin umbra. It doesn't mean water. It means shade, shadow. And in the ancient world, shade was power. The same object appears independently across the oldest civilizations on Earth. Egypt, Assyria, India, China, Greece, Rome. A canopy on a stick carried by a servant held above the head of a king. Not for his comfort, for the message it sent. The pool of shadow it cast was a portable piece of the divine, and standing inside it told everyone watching exactly where you ranked in the order of things. A servant held it. A ruler sat beneath it, and everyone else stood in the sun. That was the entire point. The umbrella didn't protect you from the sky. It separated you from the crowd. It was one of the first objects humans ever made whose real function was to be looked at, a device for turning rank into something you could see from across a courtyard. Then, in China, the object quietly changed in a way that would eventually reach all the way down to the thing in your bag. Chinese craftsmen took the parasol and made it fight water. They coated the paper canopy in oil and wax, sealing it, turning a sunshade into a rain shield. And they built versions that folded and collapsed. The distant ancestors of the mechanism you snap open without thinking every time it drizzles. But here's what's strange. Even waterproofed, even genuinely useful, the umbrella refused to become ordinary. For centuries, it kept traveling the world as an emblem of status, not a tool. And when it reached Greece and Rome, it picked up a new meaning, one that would haunt it for the next 1,000 years. It became a women's accessory. A lady carried a parasol, or had a servant carry it for her to keep the sun off her skin. It was delicate, decorative, feminine, and a man who carried one was carrying something that, by the unspoken rules of the time, simply did not belong to him. That idea, that the umbrella was effeminate, foreign, and faintly ridiculous for a man to be seen with, survived for over 1,000 years. It was still alive, still waiting in the rain-soaked streets of London, when one stubborn man decided he'd finally had enough of getting wet. Now we get to the part of the story nobody tells you. The year is the 1750s. The place is London, a city where it rains constantly, and where, if you were a gentleman caught in that rain, you had exactly two options. You could pay for a carriage, or you could get soaked to the bone. That was the system. Rain was a tax, and the men who collected that tax were the ones who drove the coaches and carried the sedan chairs. Into that system walks a man named Jonas Hanway. Hanway was a traveler and a philanthropist. He had seen umbrellas used against the rain in other countries, and he'd quietly concluded something that everyone around him considered absurd: that a man might simply keep himself dry. So he made a decision that sounds like nothing today, and was close to social suicide then. He started carrying an umbrella, openly, through the public streets of London. As a man, the reaction was not amusement. It was hostility. He was mocked in the street, called effeminate, called foreign. Strangers shouted at him. But the sharpest abuse didn't come from people who simply found him ridiculous. It came from the men whose livelihood he was quietly threatening. Because think about who loses money the moment a man can keep himself dry for free. The coach drivers, the sedan chair carriers. Every downpour was a payday for them. And here was a man strolling past in the rain, perfectly dry, owing them nothing, holding the solution over his own head. They didn't see an umbrella. They saw a threat to their trade. And they made sure he knew it, heckling and abusing him from their stands as he passed. Hanway didn't stop. He carried that umbrella for the next 30 years. And here's a detail you'll find repeated almost everywhere, one worth correcting, because the truth is stranger than the myth. People will tell you it was illegal for a man to carry an umbrella in those years. It wasn't. There was no law. There was something far harder to fight than a law. There was ridicule, a rule nobody had ever written down and everybody enforced. Hanway wasn't breaking a statute. He was breaking a code. And codes are defended more fiercely than laws, because the people enforcing them feel like they're defending themselves. Slowly, it worked. Year after year, the sight of one dry man in the rain became a little less strange. Other men tried it. The laughter thinned. And by the time Jonas Hanway died in 1786, the very thing he'd been tormented for was on its way to becoming completely unremarkable. For a while, Londoners even called the umbrella a Hanway, named after the man who had been willing to look ridiculous for longer than everyone else was willing to laugh. He didn't invent the umbrella. He did something harder. He absorbed 3 decades of public humiliation so that you would never have to think twice about staying dry. By the way, if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. The one who wants to know what's actually behind things, not the surface version. The real one. If that's you, hit subscribe. Now back to our story. Because for all of Hanway's courage, the umbrella was still, frankly, a bad object. It was heavy, awkward. The ribs that held the canopy open were made of whalebone or thick cane, stiff, prone to snapping, and clumsy to carry. The umbrella had become socially acceptable long before it became any good. That changed in 1852 in the steel city of Sheffield with a man named Samuel Fox. Fox designed a frame built from light steel ribs. He called the design the Paragon. It was lighter than whalebone. It was stronger than whalebone. And, most importantly, it was cheap to manufacture at scale. This is the precise moment the umbrella stops being a statement and starts being a product. With a steel frame and factory production behind it, the price of the umbrella collapsed. The object that had been a symbol of the gods, then a badge of rank, then the mark of one man's stubbornness, became something almost anyone could afford to own. It flooded the streets. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the umbrella became ordinary. And it never stopped falling. Today, it's one of the cheapest manufactured objects on the planet. The overwhelming majority are made in a single region of China, the same civilization that first waterproofed the parasol 2,000 years ago, now turning them out by the hundreds of millions. You can buy one from a street vendor the second the sky opens, use it twice, and toss it in a bin the moment it flips inside out. The object men were once pelted for carrying is now something you abandon on a train without a flicker of guilt. So here's what the umbrella actually is. It's a record of who mattered. For almost its entire life, it had nothing to do with the weather. It was about rank, about gender, about the invisible rules that quietly decide who is allowed to do what. The sunshade held over a pharaoh and the bent nylon thing in your bag are the same object. And the distance between them is the entire story of how a symbol of absolute power becomes something you lose and don't even notice is gone. And buried inside it is one more thing. A reminder that almost everything you now do without a second thought was once unthinkable. That somebody, somewhere, was the first person to do the obvious thing and got laughed at for it. The umbrella is ordinary today because one man agreed to be ridiculous for 30 years. So, the next time it rains, and you put up that flimsy, forgettable $8 object without a single thought in your head, remember that you're holding the very end of an extraordinarily long story. A piece of the divine shrunk down to a sunshade. A sunshade shrunk down to a scandal. A scandal shrunk down to a thing in the bottom of your bag. You're not just staying dry. You're standing in a shadow that once belonged only to kings. If you enjoyed today's episode of the Hidden Chronicle, hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment below on another everyday object you'd like uncovered. Next week, we stay close to home, with something you reach for every single day and have never once stopped to question. Take a look around. History is everywhere.